Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 52nd and final chapter in the book of Jeremiah. Herein we read of the conquest of Judah and the destruction of the temple. We can also read of the similar scenarios in the 39th chapter in the same book, and also in the 25th and final chapter of the second book of Kings, and in the 36th and final chapter of the second book of Chronicles. But both of these tragedies, those being the conquest of Judah and the destruction of the temple, were in hindsight entirely preventable. The latter, now Jeremiah had advised the reigning king to surrender to the Babylonians and spare the city and the temple. This ultimately landed him in prison for being a traitor, even though he was offering the most useful line of advice because he was a real prophet. But the covenant of Israel, as delivered through Moses, determined their destiny, and it was a faith-based and obedience covenant, according to which there were consequences for disobedience and blessings for prosperity in the event of obedience. Now, the symptoms of national decline are parallel in virtually every nation: perpetual war, perpetual debt, moral decay, and dissoluteness. But in Judah's and Israel's, there are two primary factors above all, those being the misplaced faith in alliances. Now, by this time, the geopolitical battle for empire had for some time been between three entities, those being Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, who ultimately triumphed over the two in 612 BM and 598 BM, respectively. Or maybe I have the order reversed, but those dates are exact, I believe. But the temptation was always for the reigning kings to place their faith in a pagan, secular alliance rather than, and this was especially the juxt of Isaiah's prophetic proclamations, to put your faith in Yahweh. And so it was misplaced faith, and it was also misplaced obedience, specifically idolatry, which was the practice of which, or the lack of indulgence in which, was to render them distinct from the neighboring nations in the ancient Aegean, and more specifically the egregious and repeated violations of the terms of the covenant. So Yahweh is long-suffering, and he did forgive, but his forgiveness and mercy and has limits, and after 586 BM he had enough, and thus begins the period of the Gentiles, during which time Judah ceased to be an independent political sovereignty and found itself at the mercy of a succession of foreign oppressors. So the opening verse reads, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. This is not to be confused with the author of this book, who also bears the same name, but Zedekiah was a young ruler, and he was still a young ruler when he when Babylon came crashing on and ended his dynasty, and as we will soon read, they did not treat him well, and it did not end well for him. And he did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. So the pattern of Judah was very much, more often than not, a fluctuation. Every time a reformer would ascend to the throne, then an idolater would succeed him and set the national path on the path of waywardness. And because kings provide the moral example in leadership, how they behave and believe very much has they are a microcosm of the macrocosm of the nation. And so now whenever a righteous king rules, justice flourishes in the land, but whenever a wicked king ascends, then injustice prevails. And the just response for this, because it had been enough, was to send them to captivity, because they had exhausted the privileges of being an independent sovereign nation in a land of milk and honey, which Yahweh had graciously provided them. For through the displeasure of Yahweh, this came to be against Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babel. Babel is synonymous with Babylon. It's just an alternate name. But at this point, Zedekiah was vassal, still preserved on the throne of Judah, which he was more or less a puppet monarch, but he aspired to be something more, and he rebelled against his overlords, his Babylonian overlords, and that that provided them with the pretext to completely destroy the city and the temple. And it came to be in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of that month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, and his army came against Jerusalem and encamped against it, and when they built a siege against it all around. Now, other translations provide the date and year, which is located somewhere thereabouts in 588 BM, and so the siege, which would culminate in the conquest in 586, began in 588, and the tactics of siege warfare we may or may not comment on more extensively as the discourse unfolds. And the city was under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So this describes the length, and this the siege had completed its purpose by 586 BM, before Messiah. On the 9th of that 4th month, this famine was so severe that in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. And Jeremiah, who also his post-collapse or conquest musings as recorded in the book of Lamentations in the 4th chapter in the 9th and 10th verse of that book, we read that the people had resorted to cannibalism. So one of the essences of siege warfare was to starve out the city by prolonged, because the tactical fact is that he who has walls and protection is invariably at a strategic or tactical advantage against the invading army. But the invading army, it was to their advantage to prolong it so much, because most cities did not have access to their agricultural output, which largely existed outside of the city. Now, Babylon was incidentally the exception, or one of the exceptions in the ancient world. They had provisions for food within their walls, and but their conquest was ultimately completed by the Medo-Persians during the reign of Belshazzar, of which we can read of in Daniel 5. Then the city wall was breached, and all the men of battle fled and went out of the city at night, by way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden, while the Castites were near the city all around. And they went by way of the desert plain. So the siege had successfully infiltrated the city at this point, and they were left to leave the inhabitants, mostly unarmed denizens, at the mercy of armed invaders. But the armies of the Castites pursued the king, and they overtook Zedekiah in the desert plain of Jericho, and his entire army was scattered from him. So as the king, he would have been at it was his duty to lead the army, and once they had captured him, then the entire army disintegrated and was no longer able to pose a united front against this united enemy. Then they captured the king and brought him to the king of Babel at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he pronounced judgments on him. And the king of Babel slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and he also slew all the heads of Judah in Riblah. So he summarily executed those who were formerly in positions of high power and influence, and this was a normal course of war. And as we read, this will be his last vision. It's going to come up in the next verse, was a gruesome spectacle, because then after he loses his eyesight. So to the 11th verse, and he put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babel bound him in bronze shackles, and took him to Babel, and put him in prison till the day of his death. So as I earlier mentioned, it did not end well for Zedekiah, and of course this was entirely preventable. He could have not rebelled and surrendered himself and avoided this dreaded fate, but The prophet Ezekiel, who was, along with Daniel, the preeminent prophet of the exile, was predicted that Zedekiah would try to escape and not see the land to which he tried to escape in. And on the 10th of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar's, king of Babel, Nebuzaradan, chief of the guard, who served the king of Babel, came to Jerusalem. And he burned the house of Yahweh, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and all the houses of the great men he burned with fire. So this servant, this lieutenant of Nebuchadnezzar, completed the destruction. He burned the palace and the temple to the ground, in addition to all the residential, or nearly all of them, in the city, and or more specifically the prominent socioeconomic people. And there would that's a predicament for which it's too late to put the water on once it's already consumed with fire. And all the army of the Cashtites, who were with the chief of the guards, broke down all the walls of Jerusalem all around. Now the walls would not be completed until the return of Nehemiah, who was allowed to do so at the behest of the Persian emperors, who were far more lenient to their Jewish subjects than their Babylonian conquerors. But the city was out protection henceforth and would be reduced to a virtual ghost town, whereby only the poorest denizens were allowed to remain, and the remainder of people were summarily escorted to Babylon to keep the subject population in a concentrated area as a control mechanism, and this effectively preserved the ethnic purity of the Judeans intact, whereas the Israelites were not nearly as lucky. The Assyrian control policy was to scatter the conquered people across the vast ranges of their empire, to intermix and intermingle, so as not to provoke any possibility of a national uprising. And they would henceafter be known as the Samaritans, and they would not be accepted by the Judeans, who, as fully Jewish because of their mixed blood and compromised worship, but that's another subject entirely. And all the army of Nebuzaradan, chief of the guard, exiled some of the poor people, and the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the defectors who had gone over to the king of Babel, and the rest of the craftsmen. So herein we ride the division of the socioeconomic scattering or lack thereof, which was more or less divided among socioeconomic lines. Those who were able to provide a useful service to their Babylonian captors would have been placed in the capital city, whereas those who were poor and destitute would have been allowed to remain in a city without protection, without walls, and virtually reduced to a ghost town, a once thriving metropolis. But Nebuzaradan, chief of the guard, left some of the poor of the land as vine dressers and farmers. So he didn't completely relocate the entire city. He left it to a pathetic remnant of its former self, and the poor of the land were left to cultivate the soil to feed themselves. And the Cashtites broke the bronze columns that were in the house of Yahweh, and the stands and the bronze sea that were in the house of Yahweh, and brought all their bronze to Babel. And this would ultimately spell the destruction of Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, of whom we read of in the 5th chapter of Daniel, because he was using these precious instruments to a feast, essentially mocking Yahweh and inadvertently daring him to a response, of which he responded accordingly. So they also took away the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the bowls and the ladies and all the bronze utensils with which they served, So they didn't limit themselves to the items mentioned in the aforementioned verse, but also extended to virtually every conceivable item or instrument which might have been contained in the walls, which they knocked down and obliterated. And the basins and the fire holders and the bowls and the pots and the lampstands and the two columns, 1C, the 12 bronze bowls which were under it, and the stands which King Solomon had made for the house of Yahweh. The bronze of all these vessels was beyond weighing. So therein we read that the mass, the volume of the items were of a somewhat incalculable weight, and Solomon originally adorned his temple with gold shields, about 300 of them, which during the reign of his son and successor, Rehoboam, after which the United Monarchy collapsed due to his colossal error of judgment, the Egyptians ransacked the city, and he then after replaced it with items of bronze. And for the columns, the height of one column was 18 amma, and its circumference was 12 amma, and its thickness was 4 etziboth, hollow. Now, I'm not entirely familiar with the equivalencies of these measurements of the ancient world to the metric system or the one we use in the United States, but it is within the range of possibility for anyone to look it up, and the temple measurements and the tabernacle before it were ordered precisely to the inch and the foot. And a capital of bronze was on it, and the height of one capital was 5 amma, with a network and pomegranates all around the capital, all of bronze, and the second column with pomegranates was the same. And there were 96 pomegranates on the side, and all pomegranates on the network were 100 all around. And the chief of the guard took Sariah, the high priest, and Zephaniah, the second priest, and all 3 doorkeepers. So by this time, the high priest would have been Seraphiah, and his most proximate underling would have been Zephaniah, not to be confused with the prophet who has a book which bears his name in the Old Testament. But as far as I know, the office of high prophet would not resume until the reconstruction of the temple, and would, after its final and irrevocable destruction by the Romans in 70 AD, it would all but cease to exist. And from the city he took one eunuch who was in charge of the men of battles, and 7 men who saw the king's face, who were found in the city, and the scribe of the commander of the army, who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people in the land, who were found in the city. So this is the litany, the list of the people that he took from the temple, and it would leave them bereft of the human resources to complete the temple work, even in the absence of the temple. And Nebuzaradan, chief of the guard, took these and brought them to the king of Babel at Riblah. And the king of Babel smote them and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. Thus Judah was exiled from its own land. So they were escorted from their location of comfort to be summarily executed, and thus begins the exile, which would last for a duration of 70 years, the duration of which was determined by the number of sabbatical cycles which the Israelites had neglected to heed in the 490 years from Joshua to Jeremiah. Although that was far from their only covenant violation, it served as the mark and measure of its duration. These are the people whom Nebuchadnezzar exiled in the 7th year, 3,023 Jews. So the precise number is provided. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he exiled from Jerusalem 832 beings. In the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, chief of the guards, exiled of the Jews 745 beings, and the beings were 4,600. So we have, there wasn't a mass, or it wasn't one-time events, the exile. It occurred in increments and progressions, and we have the precise figures as to exactly how many were taken away during these chronological intervals. And it came to be in the 37th year of the exile of Joachim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th of the month, that Evil-Madrich, king of Babel, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. So Jehoiakim was, I believe, Zedekiah's uncle, and he was removed from the throne somewhere abouts near the year 597 BM, which actually marks the initial period of the first wave of Babylonian exiles. Ezekiel was one of the ones who went in that year. Daniel was in 586 BM. But he, even though he was replaced, his life ended better than his replacement, and spoke kindly to him, and placed his throne above those of the kings who were with him in Babel. So he changed his prison garments, and ate bread continually before the king all the days of his life. So even though he had been treated somewhat abysmally by his father, Nebuchadnezzar, the new king, his successor, treated him with leniency and generosity and courteousness befitting his formerly royal station. And as for his allowance, there was a continual allowance given by the king of Babel, a portion of each day until the day of his death, all the days of his life. So even though it's somewhat a marked deterioration from the royal splendor he once enjoyed, it was still better than nothing. And when adversity comes, you have to make the best of things and seize opportunities as they present themselves. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.